So the topic today is a really simple three-step process to help you persuade even the toughest audiences. And quite often we're asked to present to groups that may not be open to what we're trying to present to them. And more often than not, the purpose of that speech is to persuade them. So these are folks that they don't necessarily have to be hostile to us, but in a lot of cases they can be at least cold to our presentation. So whether you're trying to sell a product or a service, or you just have a good idea that you're trying to get your audience to approve of, persuasion is really important. So in this session, we're going to cover a few simple steps, like a really simple three-step process to help you persuade, that audience. And in the beginning, though, we're going to talk about how human nature and how persuasion works, and then we're going to talk about the actual three-step process later on. So in the first part, let's kind of start with what I call human insights. It's human nature, the human insight, things that you need to really be aware of before you start to try to persuade other people. So before we even talk about techniques and skills needed to persuade other people, let's start with how human beings are wired. There are a few common traits among all people they're pretty important to remember. And often when we fail to persuade audiences, it's because we're going against human nature. We're going against the grain of the way that human beings like to think, right? I'll give you an example. When I was younger, I lived in Boulder, Colorado for a summer. Loved it, by the way. Loved Colorado. And to stay in shape, because I was young back then and somewhat in shape at the time, I would go jogging up the mountainside. And by the way, jogging up a mountainside is really, if you've never done it, it's really challenging. The higher you go, the harder it gets. And because I was working against gravity. But the reason I love doing that, though, was because, this really made the whole process worthwhile, is that, that once I got to my stopping point, I never got to the top of the mountain, by the way. I'm not in that great of a shape, but basically wherever I stopped and turned around, all the way back to my apartment was really, really easy. It was basically the last half of the run was like a piece of cake compared to what I'd just done. And that's the way, what's what most people do when we're trying to persuade other people. It's like we're jogging up the mountainside. Well, the process that I'm going to show you later on is we're going to show you how you can work with human nature, and it's like jogging downhill. It makes it still have to put out some effort, but it's going to be much, much, much easier. So just the first human insight that you really need to be aware of is that people like other people who agree with them, and they dislike people who disagree with them. It sounds pretty obvious, but you'd be amazed how often people use an argument to try to persuade somebody else, or in a lot of cases to try to persuade a group. So when we start our persuasive message by trying to prove to the audience how correct we are, we can experience an unfortunate consequence from that. Because you see, when other folks hear someone talking about how right they are, they automatically assume that the person is telling them that they're wrong, right? By the way, this is a really good example from history that I found in the early days of Standard Oil. This was back in the mid 1800s. John D. Rockefeller, he was a guy that had great business sense. Obviously, one of the most successful business people ever in the history of the United States. Well, his partner in Standard Oil was a guy named Samuel Andrews, and Samuel Andrews knew how to refine crude oil into kerosene. At the time, by the way, that he was doing this was a really, really new concept. It had the concept of use prior, 10 years prior to them doing this, oil was the stuff that it was a waste product. You didn't want that on your anywhere around you. I mean, if you found that on your land, your land was kind of worthless until they figured out that you could refine the oil and turn it into kerosene and make lamps or lanterns out of it. So once they figured this out, by the way, new oil companies were popping up, all over the place every month. And Rockefeller knew, though, that all of these brand new oil companies and all of the oil that was found would need to be refined. And since Andrews knew how to refine it, then their partnership grew pretty quickly. So Standard Oil, was kind of like an overnight success because they had what all of these other people needed, all these other companies needed. So eventually, though, another engineer figured out a better way to refine the crude. And at that time, Andrews, that was what he brought to the partnership. And so he felt slighted. He felt Rockefeller was discounting what he was adding to the company. And in a heated discussion with Rockefeller, basically he threatened to leave the company. Well, the next morning, Rockefeller, not being a dumb guy, obviously, he gave him a $1 million check for his 16% of Standard Oil. And he took it, Andrews took it. So, by the way, the new engineer, the reason why I'm kind of telling you this story in a persuasion session is that new engineer had a better way to do what Andrews was already doing. And he showed Andrews and Rockefeller his way. Rockefeller bought into it. Andrews never did. He never persuaded Andrews because Andrews felt slighted. And in fact, he left the company in anger and missed out on billions of dollars in the process. And a lot of times that's what tends to kind of happen when we're not using good people skills, when we're not using human nature to try to persuade people. Sometimes we can cause them just by the way that we're giving them information. It may be really good information, but if we don't present it in the right way, they may take it the wrong way and miss out on some great opportunities. So by the way, human nature makes us want to try to play devil's advocate, by the way, when people try to persuade us with facts. So that's kind of the second really big insight. So the reason why this is important is that the moment, if I'm trying to persuade you, the moment that I tell you that I know a fact is absolutely 100% true, this thing is always true, it is 100% accurate, you're likely going to want to argue with me. It's human nature. A lot of times people will think, I can think of at least one situation where that's not true, and they try to find the anomalies. It's human nature. People do that automatically. And in addition, when we start the persuasive statement with an opinion, we're also opening ourselves up to disagreement. Like, for instance, anytime a group of people are sitting around a boardroom and, like you've got half a dozen people or so sitting around a table, and one person starts the conversation with, well, I think, right? You'll likely see a disagreement start very shortly after that, because a person on the other side of the table is often going to respond with, well, that might be a good idea, however, I think, right? And now you got two people giving opinions, and then the discussion just becomes a popularity contest. So remember that winning people to your way of thinking is hard. It's not natural. It's something that kind of goes against human nature, and people naturally tend to want to argue. It's the way that we're wired. It's the way that we're built. So if you try to persuade a tough audience the way that most people do, you've got a lot riding against you. You've got a lot going against you in the beginning. So basically, what I want to do in the rest of this session is kind of explore a better way to persuade people. In fact, I'm going to show you a really simple 3-step process to help you persuade even the toughest audiences. By the way, I got this from a number of different sources, but the person that kind of brought this to on the forefront was Dale Carnegie. I don't know Dale Carnegie. I read his book, but in the early 1900s or so, Dale Carnegie wrote a book called The Quick and Easy Way to Effective Speaking. And in that book, he outlined a persuasive technique that he called it the magic formula. And I'm pretty sure that the Dale Carnegie folks kind of still use this because it's phenomenal. So the first time that I read that book, by the way, after reading Carnegie kind of lay this out, I thought, man, this Carnegie guy, he's absolutely brilliant. That he came up with this. And then it wasn't until later on, after I started doing some research, that I realized that this technique, it uses human nature to work with the persuader versus against him. And of course, later on, I realized that many famous leaders use this same technique. In fact, if you've ever read the Bible, Jesus used the technique. to teach the multitudes 300 years before Jesus. Aesop's fables, he used the technique. And near as I can tell, throughout all of human history, great leaders have used this formula, but for some reason, the average person still goes against human nature and wants to argue. So basically, this is what Carnegie laid out in his three-step process, which is what he called his magic formula. He said, number one, you want to start with an example or a story. And then secondly, after you give an example or a story, then give your advice or opinion. And then finally, at the end, tell the audience how they're going to benefit from that suggestion. So let's start with that first part. Start with an example or a story. And the reason why you want to do that, by the way, is it reduces the defenses, the natural defenses that pop up with people when we try to persuade them. It also helps us really build rapport with the person very effectively. So by the way, Carnegie was absolutely correct, when he called this the magic formula, because stories are magical. For those of you who have read my post on how to manipulate people, which I did a couple of months ago, I actually did that for fun, but it was fascinating. It's a fascinating story. If you haven't watched that on YouTube, or if you haven't listened to that on my podcast, make sure you go back and really delve into that, because it is a fascinating study. But you may recognize some of the stuff that we're going to talk about here, because manipulators often use stories as a way to get the listener to fall into what they call a trance. This is like hypnotists use that term, but it's nothing mystical, by the way. And I explain this in great detail in the manipulation series, but this is basically getting the listener to think of like a mini daydream. Because these manipulators, if somebody's trying to manipulate us, they know that the mind is more malleable when it's in a trance-like state. So I'll give you just a really good example, just a really simple example of how this works, and to keep you from falling into this trap from people manipulating you. So like this just happened to me a couple of days ago. I kind of woke up. I was pretty groggy, so I jumped into the shower to wake up. Got in on hot water and was steamy and everything. And then after I dried off, I stumbled over to my sink to brush my teeth and shave. But when I did, though, I banged my toe, something really fierce, on the bathroom scale that was at my feet. And of course, I gritted my teeth because my wife was still in bed, and I didn't want to wake her up by shouting out a bunch of foul language. That actually really did happen, unfortunately. So there's a good chance that as I told that little incident, as I explained what happened to me a couple of days ago, that you saw this kind of little mini movie in your head that took place. And a lot of times it probably took place in your own bathroom, right? Because when I said I was in the bathroom, you probably kind of pictured your own bathroom. When I got to the part about banging my toe, you might have actually even kind of gritted your teeth a little, because I did that myself, right? The key thing here, though, is that I was telling you a story, and you were right there with me. You were painting the images in your head of what was going on. You were playing along, basically. So your natural defenses didn't pop up. And most likely, you probably weren't thinking something, as I was telling that story about banging my toe, you probably weren't saying something like, it's totally not true. Doug's just lying there, right? In fact, the opposite is probably more likely. You were probably thinking, God, man, I believe that because I've done something similar in the past, right? And that's really the power of stories. That's what stories do, is they work with human nature instead of against it. Basically what that does is it helps us really build that rapport with the audience, because it's relatable to people. When we tell a story or give an example, they're like, oh, okay, I can see where that is true. Instead of what most people do when we give them a fact or a figure or an opinion, they automatically say, oh, well, I can think of at least 2 or 3 situations where that is not true, right? And they become defensive, and the walls kind of pop up. So stories are a way to kind of drop those walls down and at least be heard at this point. So then once we kind of give them an example or a story of what we're talking about, the next thing you want to do is reveal what I call the moral of the story, or an action, or a piece of advice, or your opinion, if that's what you're giving, right? So like, for instance, when I was in first grade, my first grade teacher used to read us Aesop's fables. She read one every day, which was kind of cool. I didn't realize until just recently kind of doing some research that Aesop, he wrote like 700 plus of these things, because she read one of them. I guess we didn't get to all of them because I think there's not that many days in first grade, right? But if some of you may recall some of these, like the tortoise and the hare, or the fox and the grapes, these are the little, those are some of the really famous ones, but these are little kind of mini stories or mini fables. And they do a couple of different things. One of the reasons why these stories are so popular and why they're still being told today and in different forms is that they both entertain, and they're kind of entertaining, and they also teach a moral, right? So, and in fact, the last line of each one of the fables, at least when my teacher read them to me anyway, was the moral of the story is, right? So basically, Aesop would actually put a moral. He would put a lesson learned from the story, or how you can take that fable and apply it in your own life. So basically, he didn't want to just tell the story and then have the person figure out the reason why the story was important. He actually told the audience why each story was important at the end of it. And if you think about it, the reason why fables work so well is because they're entertaining. It's the entertaining story is actually told first. Like for instance, if Aesop had, if he used the current boardroom strategies that a lot of us use to persuade people, then his fables probably would have sounded something like this, because this is what happens in most boardrooms. Well, I think you should pace yourself and be slow and steady. It's fox and the hare, right? And then, or in my opinion, you tend to despise those things that are out of your reach. Or maybe another example would be, well, here's what you should do. Show a little kindness, for gosh sake, right? So when you hear those morals stated that way, what kind of reaction do you have? As I said, those three statements, what kind of reaction kind of popped in? Most likely you're thinking, heck no, man, you got to run fast if you want to win. Or only immature people feel that way. Or I'm as kind as the next person who you pointing fingers at, right? It's weird how if we start with the advice or the opinion, people think that we're actually pointing fingers at them, that we think that the defenses kind of pop up. In reality, though, those are exactly those are the exact morals that Aesop was teaching in some of his fables. But because he started with the story first, we hear them when we think, oh wow, that's a pretty good idea, right? So when we hear the story first and then we hear the moral, we go, oh yeah, totally makes sense, right? And that's the way you want your audience to react when you try to persuade them. So start with an example, then give your advice or your opinion or the moral of the story, and they'll be more open to it. And then the last step in this magic formula is you want to finish with how the advice will actually benefit the audience. And by the way, this going back to that manipulation session that I mentioned, in that session, I mentioned the difference between persuasion and manipulation really just lies in the purpose, right? When people persuade, a lot of times we're doing that for the benefit of the listener. If I'm trying to persuade you to do something, it's for your own benefit. I'm not trying to get something in return. But when people are trying to manipulate another person, they're doing so for their own benefit at the expense of the other person. So big, huge difference there. Very similar technique, but totally different results from it. So the ending to your persuasive speech, your little mini persuasive speech, needs to have a benefit to the audience built into it. That way, there's really no way for the audience to think that you're trying to manipulate them. So if you go back to human nature, what we were talking about earlier, people are pretty self-centered for the most part. I mean, we're the human beings are we're created that way, right? We're fairly self-centered, self-focused. So we always want to know, hey, what is in this for me? So so basically when you're trying to persuade somebody, if you end your presentation by telling them what's in it for them, if you tell them what they're going to get, they're going to be more likely to agree with you. So remember what I said earlier, people like it when folks agree with them, and they dislike it when people disagree with them. So if you help somebody else agree with you, now we're in step, we're in rapport, right? So, and by the way, here are a few tips that you can use and some examples that will help you persuade better. Like for instance, when I teach salespeople how to communicate better with customers, and sometimes these are my own salespeople, and in many cases, though, these are customers that hire me to go out and kind of coach them. I like to get them to focus more on solving problems for their customers. So a lot of times what I'll do is at the very beginning, when I'm first starting to coach, I'll say, hey, so what are a few of the major problems that you solve for your customers or your clients? And why do, or another example might be, why do they need your product or service? What is it, what's happening to them right now that's causing them to need to have whatever it is that you're offering? And like, for instance, in my own company, when customers hire my company to come out and do sessions for them or classes or coaching for them, there's usually a few challenges that they're experiencing that they kind of need help with. Like, for instance, a part of my company, it deals with meetings and conventions, so they may have a meeting or a convention scheduled, and they may have a lot of stuff on the agenda that's kind of dry and boring, and so they hire our instructors to help add some fun and make the agenda more interactive and that kind of thing. Or another challenge might be this happens sometimes where, let's say, a new management has come in. Let's say a person has just been promoted to being the new manager, or has been hired from the outside. Or in some cases, it might be where two companies are merging together, or two departments are merging together, where company cultures are being blended. So that can be kind of a challenge. And so sometimes they'll have us come in and work with their teams to make sure that blending is more efficient, right? So if we know that a company is experiencing one of these challenges, we can use this persuasive formula to show them how we can help them, right? We can help them fix that problem, or show them how we can help them fix the problem. So I'll take the first example first and use the persuasive speech formula, starting with a story, giving them my opinion or my advice, and then telling them how they're going to benefit from that if they do that thing. And I'll use that as an example first. So let's just say that somebody just wants to add some fun to their meeting. So I can just start off with an example of something that happened very recently. Like, for instance, actually just a couple of weeks ago, I had a nonprofit in Pennsylvania that hired me to do a virtual breakout session for them. And by the way, the director of the association mentioned that the group met virtually every single month. And a lot of times, though, the meetings were kind of one-sided, meaning that she tended to have to do a lot of the talking. She wasn't getting a whole lot of feedback. And even when she asked, a lot of times she would say, hey, can I get some feedback? And it would be kind of dead silence in a lot of situations. So knowing this, within the first few minutes of the session, when I started teaching them, I gave the group what I call a mini assignment. So basically, I taught them something really quickly, and then I divided them up into Zoom breakout rooms with a partner. So they're just one-on-one with another person, another participant on the meeting. And then I asked them to tell their partner the idea that they came up with in that little assignment, right? It's just, hey, tell your partner what idea you came up with. And after a couple of minutes, I shut down the breakout rooms and then had the group return to the main session. And then when the main session was back, when I had everybody back in the main group, I asked them if any of their partners had a really good idea that they liked. And then instantly I had the group reporting what their partner said one by one, right? So it's a really simple technique that makes virtual meetings way more interactive and fun. In fact, the moment that one of those people heard his or her partner speak up and praise that idea that he or she came up with, and their confidence kind of soared. So from that point on, that was in the first 10 minutes of that session. So from that point on, the meeting leader didn't have to do a whole lot to get the group to respond. They actually wanted to, because we were training them to do that. So the point of the story, though, is that there are really fun, simple, and turnkey things that you can do in your next meeting. And if you do to make your session more interactive and more fun, if you do those things, then your team's going to have a whole lot more fun. The whole session is going to be more interactive, and you'll get a whole lot more out of it. Does that make sense? I mean, it's just, I'm telling them, I spent a minute and a half, 2 minutes or so, kind of going through that example of how I had added fun and interactivity to a virtual meeting. And at the end gave a really quick, what I call an action benefit statement. So I gave them my advice and then gave them a benefit to them. Here's another example. Let's say that we picked the other thing, one of the other major things that my company does, where we're helping a company where team cultures are being merged. This is one thing that can be pretty challenging. So a couple of years ago, that's probably 5 or 6 years ago now, I had a client who it was a pretty good sized company that purchased two of their biggest competitors. So basically, this was an industry that there really wasn't a whole lot of competition in, and so they basically, by purchasing their two biggest competitors, they created kind of a monopoly, which was kind of cool for the new CEO. But one of the things that he figured out, though, was that the owners of the two companies that had been purchased, they used to work together and they had kind of a falling out. So the apprentice, the person who used to work for the owner of the other company, decided, at one point they were working together and he decided they didn't like the heavy-handedness of the boss. And so he went out on his own, started a competitive company and did pretty well, by the way. So, but because he didn't like the way his boss ran the company, he did the exact opposite in his leadership style. So what the first boss was a type A alpha male type person. And then, so this guy was way more democratic. And when the companies merged, when those three companies tried to create a single culture, these cultures just clashed. It was totally different. And so when they asked me to come in to help, I mean, I knew I was walking into a minefield. So I suggested that we start by doing an assessment. So what we did a survey, I interviewed and surveyed about a dozen or so of dozens really of people from each of the merging companies. And then I compiled that data and then I presented it to the three executives at one time and showed them how the team viewed them, the three of each one of them individually as leaders. And as they kind of flipped, it was really scary, by the way, as a consultant coming in, because it wasn't really good news. And as they flipped through the results, it was like dead silence in the room. They didn't say anything. And once the initial shock wore off, the new CEO looked at me and asked, I mean, he was the one that was in between the other two. He said, "Okay, so how do we fix it?" And I knew I had to respond really delicately at that point because I knew that egos were on the line here. But I mean, that's what they were paying me. They were paying me to help them. So I turned to the two executives that had the strained relationship, and I said, "Hey, you two worked together for over a decade, right?" And they both nodded at me, and I said, "During that time, you learned I turned to the guy that was the apprentice, the guy that learned from the older guy. And I said, during that time, you learned a tremendous amount from this man, didn't you?" And he nodded, right? And then I turned to the other executive and I said, "And when this guy was on your team, the morale was off the charts high, wasn't it?" And he nodded. And since you split, neither of your companies have grown as fast as you did when the two of you were together. And they both begrudgingly kind of agreed, right? So once we kind of broke down the barriers a little bit and got them started discussing and showed how each one of those three executives had a value to this new company, that if they worked together, they were going to accomplish a whole lot more than fighting with each other, right? So once I got the executives working as a team, it was actually fairly easy to train the team itself, right? So basically what I would suggest that you do is if you hire us to help you with this merger, you can basically have us give an independent third-party assessment of what's going on. That's going to keep the egos from interfering with your progress. Right. So basically, again, I spent most of the time telling the story and getting you captivated and playing the little movie in your head. And then at the end, tell you what I really wanted you to do. So basically, if you think about those two little examples that I gave, did they really use human nature effectively? The big question really is, did the examples make you want to argue with me, right? Did they say, "Oh, Doug, that's just not true. You can't do that, right? That's not going to work." And if not, if the examples that I gave didn't make you want to argue with me, if they didn't, then why not? What was it about the technique that made you less likely to disagree with me? So basically, a good technique you can use, by the way, to apply this is to you really have to fight the urge to argue. So when, before you respond, maybe somebody interrupts you while you're presenting, or they ask you a question or something like that. And before you respond the way that most of us want to in human nature and kind of show how right we are, sometimes a better way to start is to kind of think in your head, okay, what's an example that I could use here? What's a story, or when have I seen this happen in the past that I could use as an example here? And then after you tell the example or story, then offer your advice. And then finally, give the audience a reason that they should follow your advice, right? What's in it for them? And if you do that, you're going to be much more likely to win people to your way of thinking.